Thank you, Madam Mayor. In relation to agenda item number 9, which relates to the change to the rules of Bronavon, Councillors Richard Clark, Councillors Jessica Powell and Councillor Veronica Crick have a personal interest as they are council-appointed representatives on Bronavon. So if those councillors could confirm that interest.
Yes.
Thank you. And then in relation to agenda item number 10, which relates to the Torfaen Community Infrastructure Levy, both Cwmbran and Pontypool Community Councils are mentioned in the report as responding to the consultation. So members of those community councils have a personal interest. The Pontypool Community Councillors are Councillors Matthew Ford, Gaynor James, Ray Mills, Richard Overton, Norma Parish and Nicholas Jones. And the Cwmbran Community Councillors are Councillors Stuart Ashley and Faye Jones. So if those members could agree to those interests.
Mayor, I'm also a member of the Cwmbran Community Council as well. So could I declare, please?
I'm not aware of any other interest. Thank you, Madam.
Members, do you have any other interest to declare?
I noticed in that article, which I did in the CIF Community Infrastructure Levy, that it mentioned the canal, and I'm both a member of the Canal Restoration Group and Monham Breck Canal Trust. Do I have to declare those as well? I would have thought so.
It's up to you, Councillor Ashley. I mean, you declared them, so they can be noted. Okay, it'll be noted on the in the minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, members.
Madam Mayor, sorry, could I note an interest? I'm actually on the Monham Breck Canal group as well. Thank you.
Can I just remind you to write it?
And me also on the Monham Breck, please.
Yeah. Okay. If you write them on the sheet as well when it goes round in the attendance register. Okay, agenda item 4, looking at the minutes, are on page 5 of the agenda from the 18th of July. Can somebody move that the minutes are correct? Anyone have to move? Thank you. Are we all agreed? Have a show. Thank you, members. Agenda item 5, update on actions. Members, the updates on what has been done to implement our previous decisions start on page 39 of the agenda. Are there any comments or questions? Okay, is everyone happy to note the updates? Show of hands, please. Members, they are noted. On agenda item 6, receipt of petitions. There are no petitions today, so we'll move on to the next item, which is item 7. Agenda item 7. Oh, doesn't want to go. We got public question time. There are no public questions again, so we'll move on to item 8. Item 8, announcements. Leader, do you have any announcements, please?
Yes, and thank you, Madam Mayor. First of all, I'd like to pay my respects to Doug, the late Doug Davis, whose funeral lots of us attended this morning. Doug was a lovely man and a dedicated servant of his community. So I think we'd all like to send best wishes to his family, including Anne and Giles at this tough time for them. I'd also like to thank councillors for enabling us to change the time of the meeting today. I was pleased to be able to read at the funeral on behalf of the council and to pay our respects to Doug's family. Secondly, I was very pleased recently to learn of the naming of James Prosser Way in Llantarnam after Private James Prosser, who was sadly killed in Afghanistan. It's particularly poignant at the moment because on the 27th of September this year, it's the 8th anniversary of James's death. James is an inspiration and a hero to us all in Torfaen. And his mother, Sarah Adams, is an inspiration too in the work that she's done to campaign for armed forces veterans and those who have lost their lives as well. I think it's a really important symbol for us to remember those who have fallen defending our freedoms in the future, and hopefully this is something that can be passed down from generation to generation. So I think that's a really positive step, and thanks to those at the council and the developers for their work ensuring that happened. Thirdly, I'd like to say well done to the organisers and the runners at the McMorris 10K at the weekend. On Sunday, the park was looking beautiful. There was over 1,000 runners. It was really bustling. The welcome that people got all the way down the valley was commented on by lots of runners from outside. But it was good to see lots of local running clubs represented as well, including one of our councillors running. I was less energetic on the day and just handed out medals, and our MP ran as well. So it was good to see the park bustling and a positive activity going on down the valley. Talking of Pontypool Park, I'd like to congratulate Pontypool RFC and Paula on their winning start to the season. They're 3 wins from 3 so far. The next league game is against Narberth on the 30th at 2:30. So I'd like to encourage anyone to get behind the team, and indeed all other local sports teams, in rugby and football and beyond across our valley. It's one of the great things of our community that so many people volunteer to help sports teams, both junior and senior, and thanks to all those who give up their time in that way. The SRS staff, 7 of them plus me, straggling along, completed a bike ride on Friday in aid of Velindre Cancer Care and Headway, the Brain Injury Association. That was after those 2 charities have helped members of staff at the SRS, so it was good to ride around with them and to visit the 5 public bodies around Gwent that the SRS provides IT services to. So thanks to all of them. The money's still coming in. I'll maybe email around a total of how much has been donated to those 2 good causes. 2 last things really. First of all, I was pleased to read the All Wales Public Accountability measures that came in recently that show that despite the tough financial times, we've improved our performance, or at least stayed constant in 2/3 of the measures, placing us 9th in Wales, well inside the top half of councils. Obviously we need to be unrelenting in our focus on performance, but I think it's right to thank members and officers who have contributed to that improvement in performance. Talking of one of those officers who's contributed consistently to improve performance in Torfaen, I'd like to wish Nigel Aurelius well as he goes in for his operation on Thursday. Nigel's a really respected officer in this council and well beyond, and we'll miss him all, but I'm very keen that he focuses on his recovery so that he can come back to us strong and re-energised to help us in the new year. So we'll all wish Nigel the best for his recovery and for a successful operation on Thursday.
Thank you, Leader. Chief Executive, do you have any announcements?
No, thank you, Madam Mayor.
Item 9 on page 41. Request for Bronavon rule change. Can I ask Dave Congreve, Assistant Chief Executive of Communities, to present your report for us, please?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, members. 3 things by way of introduction to the report before we get into some of the detail as to why this report is in front of you and some of the reasons behind it. First thing to say is that Keith would normally present this report, but I know he's away on annual leave and therefore offers his apologies. Second thing to say is that I'm going to be very ably supported because I don't know all of the detail that sits behind this, but I know that there are colleagues in the room very helpfully that do. So with the right protocols, if we need to seek assistance, I will do so. Thank you, Madam Mayor. And the third thing is that there's a minor change to the wording in 12.1.2, where in putting the report and the appendices together, there's a minor referencing error. So I would just ask all members just to delete the reference to Rule 34 in paragraph 12.1.2. I'll explain why. Essentially, there are 2 sets of meetings referenced within the appendices, and Rule 34 isn't relevant in the context of this report. So it makes no difference to the substantive context. It's just a referencing error. Right, having said those 3 things by way of introduction, I'm just going to take you very briefly through the report and the reasons why it's in front of you today. I think the report purpose is very clear. Full Council needs to consider any changes that are proposed in relation to the board membership arrangements in relation to Bronavon Community Housing Association. This report therefore summarises both those changes to the composition and the quorum that Brunavon are seeking, and the detail of those is summarised in 3.1, and I'll take you through those in due course. I think by way of introduction, I think it's worth just reflecting on the fact that the report makes reference to three major strategic issues that are facing RSLs throughout Wales. The first of those seems a little bit technical, and this is where I may need some support, is to do with the reclassification by the Office of National Statistics in relation to the type of organisation that RSLs are. Now, if when the first time you read that, you thought, actually, that sounds a bit geeky, it is actually quite significant, I think, in terms of the way in which governance and long-term planning is carried out for RSLs, and that's the focus of this report. The board's main purpose is around long-term governance and planning. So that's the relationship, and I'll explain a little bit about that in a second. The second big strategic issue that I think is referenced in the report is the independent review that Brunavon have undertaken in preparation for some of those changes. So that's a bit of a self-assessment for those of us who are involved in the regulatory world to help prepare for that. And the third is the reference to the regulatory reform that Welsh Government is putting in place, and that's referenced in paragraph 8.4. So it's those three strategic issues, each with their implications for long-term governance and control at a board level, that are driving this report. In effect, I guess the way to think of this is that Brunavon are anticipating a very different governance environment for their board in terms of the strategic, the financial and the legislative planning, and this is helping them prepare. This is their request to help them prepare for that. Okay, if I just talk very briefly, and I may need some assistance later on if there are questions on this, just around the reclassification issue. That's something that's happened at a UK level, and it essentially sets out how UK government now are seeing registered social landlords for the purposes of public accounts and public accountability, if you like. And there are inferences in that for governance and for planning. The reclassification means that RSLs are really being seen across the UK government as a public sector organisation, which is slightly different to the approach that Welsh Government wants to take in seeing them in returned, if you like, almost to the private sector. So we can talk about that in a few seconds if we wish. But I think the importance to this report really is the very complex arrangements that are going to be needed around how government sees RSLs and what that infers for the governance arrangements of each of those registered social landlords. So that's the first issue that's referenced in the report. Some of the skills, therefore, that Brunavon are seeking to ensure that they are recruiting to their board will help with that, the gaps that I think they may have in that kind of environment, or they perceive they have in that environment at the moment. So that's the second issue around their governance review. And the third issue, I think, really is around that new regulatory framework, which is referenced in 8.4 and which was published in June of this year. And I guess we can give you more details on that if members so want. All of those things together, I think, make it an appropriate time for Brunavon to request and for the Council to consider then some changes to their governance arrangements. The report sets out the background as to why we helped create Brunavon Community Housing and some of the benefits we've had from that from our communities. But the focus of this report is very much on the governance and the board arrangements. If I take you on then, having given you what I consider to be the essential background, those three big strategic drives that are going on, to some of the information in the report and some of the specific changes. They're set out in paragraph 5 of the report onwards. So 5.1 just confirms that the total board size is 12 and there is no proposal to change the size of the board. 5.4 talks about the proposed changed composition that Brunavon are seeking, and that's moving away from a balance of 4, 4 and 4 to a balance of 2 tenant members, 2 council members and 8 independent board members with the appropriate skills. 5.4 confirms that recruitment of those independents will be based on their knowledge and skills, taking into account that very different environment going forward. And 5.9 therefore seeks an adjustment to the quorum to mean that a quorum going forward for the board would be a simple majority of 50%, irrespective, if you like, of what type of board member is represented at those meetings or those board arrangements. So that's essentially the information in the proposals. I suppose the only other issue that's really relevant to comment on at this stage is risk, and that's referenced in 8.3, with the relevant consideration here being that the Council, under the stock transfer agreement that we put in place with Brunavon, is obligated to consider and not unreasonably delay or withhold our consent for any changes that are sought on the governance arrangements, including those that are advised by the regulator. So I think we've got to be very mindful of that position in terms of the consideration that you give to that as council. If there is a risk of dispute around that, then referral. There is a disputes process that is referenced in the report briefly as well, but I'm sure that is something that we can only just reference rather than dwell on. So I think given that context, given those specific changes, the recommendation therefore is drafted for you to consider approval of those changes, and I'll just remind you that we've agreed to delete the reference to Rule 34 in 12.1.2. If I end my presentation there in terms of providing you with the information, you can open up any discussion that you so wish. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Members, are there any questions or comments? No? Okay then. The recommendations are on page 45 of the agenda. Can I ask for a mover and seconder, please? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, can I have a show of hands? All those in favour? Thank you. Anyone against? Anyone abstaining? No, thank you, members. The recommendations are agreed. Moving on to agenda item 10 on page 81, the Torvine Community Infrastructure Levy. Can I ask Adrian Wilcock, Principal Planner, to present your report for us, please?
Thank you. We'll do it from this side because I'm a double act with Steve today, because if you've got questions, it needs two of us to answer them. Right. Last October, Council resolved to start the process of introducing a community infrastructure levy for Torvine. We call that a SIL, so I'll keep referring to it as a SIL. With the income that we raise being spent on infrastructure to support the delivery of our local development plan and the local community. Now, because SIL's quite complex, you can probably tell from the report, it's not simple to understand. We held a member seminar earlier this month to explain the SIL, and that was especially for new members. Now, in simple terms, if there can be such a thing for the SIL, the SIL is £1 per square metre tax on certain types of new development, where viability shows that the SIL can be paid in addition to the cost of Section 106 planning obligations sought by the Council. Hopefully you had your member training for planning and you know what a Section 106 is, but it's generally obligations that secure recreation, open space and especially affordable housing, and that's associated with the development itself, whereas the SIL can be spent throughout the county borough. There's not so many rules associated with the SIL and how we can collect it. Now, like most other councils, we've done viability work, and that shows that we can only charge SIL on larger residential developments and larger retail uses outside of our 3 town centres. For all other land uses, such as offices and factories, there would be no SIL charge. Now, at paragraph 5.10 of your report on page 89, we've got the SIL charging schedule. Nice one. Yeah. I know it's full of code, isn't it, all of this, I'm afraid. Now, as I've said, all those charges are contained in the charging schedule, and the SIL regulations, there's a massive amount of law that regulators bring in the SIL in, require us to basically have 2 public consultation stages before we as a council submit the SIL for independent examination, and then based on that independent examiner's report, finally decide whether to approve and introduce a SIL charge for Torvine, which hopefully, all going well, there's a lot between now and then, will be October 2018. That's hopefully giving you a background on the SIL. Now, returning to the purpose of the report, officers consulted, and it's more code again, on the preliminary draft charging schedule, which was the first stage at the end of last year, and 12 representations were received. We're required by the SIL regulations to consider them before you make another decision, and the report of consultation attached to Appendix 2 of your report gives summaries of those representations, offers of comments, and most importantly, recommendations for your consideration on them. Now, returning to the sort of back end of the report, it's Section 12, which are all your sort of 3 main recommendations. The Council, all we're seeking at the moment is permission to carry out the next stage of public consultation, and that's on the draft charging schedule, as well as other matters, including what we call the Council's draft Regulation 123 infrastructure list. Now that's contained at paragraph 5.18 on pages 92 and 93 of your report. And that's basically a list of the infrastructure that the Council would seek to fund through SIL rather than Section 106 obligations. The report, in the report it describes we're not allowed to collect the tax for both. That's known as double dipping, so that's one of these other complicated rules that we have. And I think there are two final points because the report's quite complex. The first is that paragraphs 5.12 and 5.13, which is on pages 1991, we provide an estimate of the revenue we believe the SIL could generate, but that is heavily dependent on sites coming forward within the identified timescales and at the scale, level of development that we've envisaged the site would encapsulate. The other final point is the report, paragraphs 4.8 to 4.11, that's on page 85, highlights two potential future changes to the SIL. The first one is that the UK SIL review report has recommended that the SIL be replaced by something called the local infrastructure tariff in 2020, and that report was put to the Westminster Government in February. The Westminster Government have said they will make a decision on whether to do that and other housing related matters in their autumn budget, which is due the 22nd of November. Now, in addition, the SIL is going to be devolved to the Welsh Government in 2018, so they could decide to do something totally different or keep the SIL. Now, the problem with that is that these two matters create uncertainty on the future of the SIL, but the report concludes, and this is an important conclusion, at paragraph 11.5, that's on page 99, that the Council should progress through the next stage and review whether to submit the SIL for examination on the light of that UK Government announcement and any representations received after we've done that consultation, which will happen over the next couple of months. So that's it. So finally, I present the report for your consideration. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Members, are there any questions or comments?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Adrian, for that. Self-explanatory, of course, from start to finish. I'm sure everybody really understood that. Sometimes with the SIL, it's been on for so long, as we know on the planning committee now, and when we have residential being built as well, on the SIL, what say is per square footage or meterage? So when it comes to residentials, not private.
Right. Well, first thing to remember that we're only looking to charge a SIL on sites of 10 or more. I've lost. Someone's cancelling me out. Yeah, so that's our threshold, and the charge ranges from £50 a square metre. If you think an average 3-bed, Steve knows this is what, 90 square metres? 4-bed, over 100 square metres. So at £50, that would be, let's get that, £5,000 a house at a 50. Is that right? Yeah, a £50 rate and £10,000 at the £100 rate. And the other key thing to remember is we're only charging the SIL basically in Cwmbran and the New Inn ward, where the viability is and the house prices are so high that the developer can afford, well, it's the landowner actually, to pay the SIL charge on top of getting a good land receipt for themselves.
Think in there as well, you've got the different areas, north, south, and there's different charges, £50, £100. Could you explain to new members why there is a difference between north and south? And what
You're right. Sorry, I cancelled you out there. No, we'll get used to it. Right. It basically comes down to the house price, yeah. If you buy a house in Blanavon, we're so sad we actually know what they go for a square metre. They sell for about £1,650 a square metre. That same house in Llanarafon will sell for £2,400 a square metre. Yes, Glyn, you live in a nice area. Yeah, so, and that's the difference. And if you think about that same house cost the developer the same amount to build, they might pay a bit different to the landowner for their land. But generally that creates a lot more income. You'd be surprised. I mean, Rich and I were told once a % rise in house price is quite a large increase in income, and it's really that income difference that causes that differential. And the other key thing I think to point out is that we've been monitoring house prices for 3-4 years. House prices have hardly risen in Blenavon, but they've risen a good 10% in the south, in Cwmbran, and it's that difference as well.
Okay, members, any other questions? Stuart? And then...
I'm going to chance my arm here. It's still for dummies again, isn't it? Bottom line is, are we actually going to get anything out of it once all your caveats are put up? Obviously, looking at this list, you're right. The further down the valley, the more likely we are likely to get something. And I believe the delivery mechanisms of community councils and people it's going to go to as worthwhile environmental projects, from what I can see. The bottom line is, what are we going to get out of it, and if we get it?
Right, so you hit, that's the $64,000 question, and it's a good question. You're probably right. We could go all the way through the sill, and none of the sites we expect to charge could come forward. That's probably unlikely. I think it'll be somewhere between the two. I think we've said the tops we'd like to get is 6 million. Because obviously we haven't been able to calculate sort of sites that come up in the future, because that's the other thing. Our plan lasts to 2021. When we have a new plan, and if the sill's in place, we'll be able to charge those new sites. So it's difficult to say. I think it's somewhere in between 0 and 6 million. Yeah.
Thank you. Completely support the report and the approach that you've taken. One of the concerns we've always had about SIL nationally is it still the case that it tends to be sort of quite regressive, in that richer areas who can charge more are going to get more out of it than less affluent areas who can't, and therefore, it's going to exacerbate the divide between different council areas depending on how much. Do you think that's still the case, and is there anything that can be done as part of this UK government review to try and rebalance that so that less affluent areas can get more money back?
Yeah, I think that's another good question, and basically the answer to that is you're right. Only areas where there's that extra value can pay. I think the beauty of the SIL is, and we've talked about it before, is we collect SIL in Cwmbran. We could spend it on a scheme in Blenavon. I'm not saying we will, and I think that's where the inequalities of the charge comes into place. There's a whole UK sort of wide discussion at the moment how you take the betterment. It's been since the 60s, Richard might know more than me, planning has always been looking at to get that increase of land value and spend it on the public good. We haven't got it right yet. I don't think the SIL's right, and I don't think the LIT's right either. There's things like an RTPI review is going to look at it, but it basically comes down to how much of that increase in land value we could take for the public good. So the only thing I can say in its defence is there is the redistribution process of it.
It's fair to say that, much like the UK government's move to allow councils in England to keep business rates, it's much more beneficial. SIL is potentially much more beneficial to areas like, let's say, Westminster or somewhere in a very affluent area with high land prices than areas like Torvine, for example, with other areas in the valleys with less high land prices.
That's sort of right, but if you look at the amount of affordable housing being obtained in London, a lot of weight is given to that existing land value and how much you can actually tax it. And it's things like Battersea Power Station was in the papers, wasn't it? That scheme has actually got a lot less affordable housing than poor old us compared to London. So it really comes down to that land value you give to the developer, to the landowner, sorry, that's the key. So, London might be able to charge, I think, what is a charge of it, 2,400 at, what's the most expensive place in England? That coastal town, isn't it? But we're not that area. I think we're quite good. I think we're sort of mid-range. We do well in Wales. We're one of the higher ability to charge sort of at the top end in this part of Wales.
Members, any more questions or comments? Okay then, recommendations are on pages 99 and 100 of the agenda. May I ask for a mover and seconder, please? Yeah, thank you. Okay, can I have a show of hands and all those in... Thank you. Anyone against? Anyone abstaining? No, thank you, members. The recommendations are agreed. On to item 11. appointments process. Can I ask Dalith Harris, the Interim Monitoring Officer, to present your report for us, please?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The purpose of this report is to agree to make minor amendments in relation to the Appointments Committee and to update the appointment process for employees. The Appointments Committee is made up of 11 members, 10 of whom are appointed by Council, and the 11th member of the committee is the executive member who holds the portfolio most relevant to the appointment being made. The Appointments Committee appoints chief officers and other posts determined by the Council to be of equal status. And it has become apparent that in many cases, more than one executive member holds the portfolio most relevant to the appointment, and therefore the Constitution needs to be amended. So the best option would be to allow the leader to decide which executive member would sit on the committee in circumstances where more than one executive member holds the portfolio. It's also become apparent that the appointments process for employees, as set out in paragraph 11.3.6 of the Constitution, needs updating, and that's to reflect the current operating environment of local government and our pay structure. So it is therefore proposed that the process is amended as set out in paragraph 4.4 of the report. And you'll see that those posts set out in paragraph 4.4.1, it is proposed that they are appointed by Council, and they are largely statutory roles. It's proposed that the Assistant Chief Executives and Chief Officers are appointed by the Appointments Committee, and all other officers to be appointed in accordance with the process to be determined by the Head of Paid Service. So the recommendation is in paragraph 5. So Council is being asked to agree that where more than one executive member holds the portfolio relevant to the appointment being made, that the leader shall decide which executive member will sit on the Appointments Committee. Secondly, that the appointment process for employees is amended as set out in paragraph 4.4 of the report, and that the Interim Monitoring Officer, in consultation with the Members' Constitution Working Party, amends the Constitution to reflect the above changes. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Members, any questions or comments? No. Okay, the recommendations you've just heard. Can I have a mover and seconder then? Thank you. Show of hands, all those in favour? Thank you. Anyone against? Anyone against? So don't keep your hands up. There we are. Anyone abstaining? Thank you, members. Recommendations are agreed. Moving on to agenda item 12. I'll turn my page and press the right button. Further term of appointment for independent members of the Ethics and Standards Committee. Can I ask Dalith Harris again to present your report?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The purpose of this report is to appoint Mrs Catherine Peggington and Mr John Irvine as independent members of the Ethics and Standards Committee for a further term of 4 years. Both were first appointed as independent members by Council for a term of 4 years from the 1st of February 2014, and the regulations state that they can be reappointed for one further term of not more than 4 years. Both Mrs Peggington and Mr Irvine have indicated their willingness to continue in office. So the recommendation is that Council approves the appointment of Mrs Catherine Peggington and Mr John Irvine as independent members of the Ethics and Standards Committee for a further term of 4 years commencing on the 1st of February 2018. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Members, any questions or comments? Okay, can I ask for a mover and seconder then for the recommendation? Thank you. Show of hands, all those in favour? Thank you. Anyone against? Anyone abstaining? No. Thank you, members. Recommendations are agreed. What's that? Okay, agenda item 13, motions on notice. Councillor Hunt, can you move and explain your motion for us, please, as shown on page 127 of the agenda?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. My motion reads that this council notes that NJC basic pay has fallen by 21% since 2010 in real terms, that NJC workers had a 3-year pay freeze from 2010 to 2012, that local terms and conditions of many NJC employees have also been cut, impacting on their overall earnings, that NJC pay is the lowest in the public sector, that job evaluated pay structures are being squeezed and distorted by the bottom-loaded NJC pay settlements, needed to reflect the increasing national living wage and foundation living wage, and that there are growing equal and fair pay risks resulting from this situation. This Council therefore supports the NJC pay claim for 2018, submitted by Unison, GMB and Unite, on behalf of the Council and school workers, and calls for the immediate end of public sector pay restraint. The NJC cannot be allowed to fall further behind other parts of the public sector. This Council also welcomes the joint review of the NJC pay spine to remedy the turbulence caused by bottom-loaded pay settlements. This Council also notes the drastic ongoing cuts to local government funding and calls on the Government to provide additional funding to fund a decent pay rise for NJC employees and the pay spine review. This Council therefore resolves to 1. Call immediately on the LGA to make urgent representation to Government to fund the NJC claim and the pay spine review and notify us of their action in this regard. 2. To write to the Prime Minister and Chancellor supporting the NJC pay claim and seek additional funding to fund a decent pay rise and the pay spine review. And 3. To meet with local NJC union representatives to convey support for the pay claim and the pay spine review. In presenting this, I'd like to declare that I'm a member of Unison Unite Unions. This motion doesn't aim to be partisan, but after consecutive years of real terms pay cuts and a growing workload, I think it's right to say that local government workers deserve a decent pay rise. You'll see at the top of the motion that their basic pay has fallen by 21% in real terms, and that's led to some real suffering from some of the people who do vital jobs in our communities. You know, we're not talking, the faceless bureaucrats that some of our print media like to portray local government workers as. These are people who run vital local services, who help keep children safe, help teach children in our schools, help keep our communities clean and tidy. Neither of these highly paid people. Our average employee earns around £18,000. They've really been caused to suffer in recent years as their pay continually gets degraded compared to the cost of living going up. So I think this is very right for us therefore to make it clear that as a council we support them in their pay claim. I think it's very important to note at this point, because it's sometimes misunderstood, or sometimes some people deliberately misunderstand this, that this doesn't include councillors. Our pay is settled separately. This is nothing to do with the pay or remuneration of councillors. This is about council employees who help run services, schools, social care, neighbourhood services, community services, things like that. I'd also like to point out that this is potentially a big boost to our local economy. Our staff tend to live as well as work in the local area, so if their pay is ever more getting squeezed, they've got less money to spend in local shops and in our local economy. So this is potentially a much needed boost to our local economy, especially as a very important employer in an area like this. When we were asked to put this motion in place, the paragraph about funding the pay rise was vital for me. I think if you look what happened last week with the questionable sort of rise given to police officers, for example, they've been given an extra 1% bonus on top of 1% for the next year, which is still a real terms pay cut. However, the big problem with that, as I see it, is that wasn't funded by the UK government. So police forces across the country are now left with the unenviable choice of having to potentially let more police officers go in order to fund a pretty derisory pay rise for some of their officers. So that's the basic context of this, and I think it's right that as the employers, as we are as councillors, that we make it clear that we believe our staff deserve a decent pay rise after several years of pay cuts and growing workload as there's fewer of them to do more and more work, and that we call on the UK government to recognise its responsibility to the workers who provide vital local services and give them a break.
Thank you, Leader. Is the motion seconded? Yeah. Okay, members, do we wish to debate the motion? Yeah, okay, if we start there and then there.
I fully support this motion, and I'd also declare I'm a member of Unite. My only little concern, and it's not to change the motion in any way, but the council subcontracts a lot of work, particularly to the third sector, and I think at some stages of the council we ought to make sure that when we're subcontracting work, that who we're subcontracting to, we should at least making sure they're paying minimum wage. I wonder if the leader has any views on that.
I'd certainly very much agree that that we need to make sure that who we contract with are compliant with the employment law.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Can I just say, can I thank Councillor Anthony Hunt for proposing this motion, and I can assure him that myself and my Conservative colleagues on this council will completely support it.
I'd just like to understand what the pay rise actually is for these employees, and also the cost to the council, and has that been forecasted in the annual accounts?
The pay claim is currently being negotiated between the unions and the national negotiating team. So we don't know yet is the honest answer to that.
And if that's the case, how can we as a council support it when we don't know the impact, effectively, of the negotiation?
Well, we're asking for the cost to be covered by the UK government, so that local services aren't affected in any way by the pay claim. But I think it's important, as a point of principle, that we recognise the genuine nature of the need for a pay rise.
Anyone else? No? Okay then. Councillor Hunt, do you wish to wrap up, or are you happy to go ahead? Okay. There's no amendments, so can we have a show of hands then in favour of the motion? Thank you. Is anybody voting against? Any abstentions? No, the motion is carried. Thank you. Moving on to agenda item 14, member question time. There's one member question for today. Can I ask Councillor Kelly Preston to ask a question, please?
Can I ask the Executive Member for Communities, Housing and Anti-Poverty, how many people across Torfaen are affected by Universal Credit, and is it possible to have an update on the impacts the Universal Credit rollout is having across the borough?
Certainly. Thanks for the question, Councillor Preston. Before trying to answer your question, I think it's probably worth reminding members of the significant change that occurred this July when Torfaen was selected by the DWP to move from live service universal credit to full service universal credit. Full service replaces 6 legacy benefits, including housing benefit, tax credits and income support. And the Department of Work and Pensions is responsible for administering universal credit, including the customer's housing costs. So there are some significant differences between the two regimes, but for now, perhaps the best way of thinking about it is that live service universal credit has been limited to new claims within a limited claimant group, and these generally are simple claims in Torfaen, such as those who are single, without children or without a health condition. And this compares with the full service universal credit, which was rolled out by DWP in July of this year in Torfaen, and applies to all new claimants from that date afterwards. So in Torfaen now, this also includes those with health problems, those who are in work, and those with children. So there's some other differences too in terms of the numbers affected by universal credit. There have been an acceleration since July this year. The DWP have updated us yesterday on the figures. However, I would like to seek clarification on some of the technical definitions included in their figures, and we'll circulate a full response over the next few weeks. That being said, at this stage, we understand that across the 2 types of universal credit, the impact has been on around 400 people affected by the live service, and around a further 190 affected by full service to date, giving a total universal credit impact of around 600 claims. So, in thanking the DWP for this provisional information, I will also ensure that we circulate a note with fuller information over the next few weeks. Second part of your question, so in terms of measuring the impacts locally, for the reasons I've just given, it's quite difficult to give us a full picture of the impacts across Torfaen at this stage. We're only the second borough in Wales to have implemented, to have had universal credit rolled out so far, and the full effects have yet to be felt across the community. Though there are effects being felt anecdotally already. I met with several local crisis intervention services who have reported an increase in the number of service users presenting with universal credit referenced. UK government's own... sorry, I missed a line. So that being said, some of the trends we're expecting to see based on the trends we're expecting to see based on evidence from Flintshire, where universal credit was first rolled out, research from Citizens Advice Bureau, and from a recent study by the DWP. The UK government's own evaluation of universal credit found that the lengthy benefit waiting times, so it's a minimum of 6 weeks, I'll try and keep going. So it's a minimum of 6 weeks, but we're finding that it's not 6 weeks. So this is 6 weeks where people are being left without any money whatsoever, and the first week it isn't paid for, so they don't get backdated on that. So the UK government's own research has found that this wait that they're having, unsurprisingly, is leading to people racking up rent arrears, debts, because they basically have no money for food or heating or rent. So they're having to turn to doorstop lenders, payday loans, whatever they can to pay the gap. So it didn't really need a study to tell you that, to be honest. It found that a quarter of new universal credit claimants have waited for more than 42 days for their first payment. That's consistent with the Citizens Advice study as well, leaving some claimants without any income to pay for food, gas, electric and rent, and leaving them exposed to doorstep lenders and racking up higher debt just to get by. This exposure to racking up debt is reflected in Citizens Advice Bureau's research, which found that 3 in 5 claimants are having to borrow money whilst waiting for their first payment. To carry on with the DWP's own findings, nearly half of families said that their moving on to universal credit has led them to falling behind with rent for the first time. 4 out of the 5 have said they've never been in rent arrears before. 4 in 10 were in rent arrears 8 weeks after they first claimed universal credit, with nearly 1 in 3 still in arrears 4 months later. So these findings are consistent with the early reports from Flintshire, where universal credit was first rolled out in Wales. More people are finding themselves in a financially precarious situation, leaving people at greater risk of eviction and homelessness. More people are resorting to debt to cover their rent and other costs whilst waiting for their first payment. And more people are resorting to food banks and crisis intervention services where they are. We're lucky in Torfaen that we do have crisis intervention services in organisations like Track 2, and we have the Welsh Church Fund, which we recently reprioritised as a hardship fund for people, and the demand on that has been exponential. These are just some of the trends we're expecting to see here in Torfaen, and these are the trends that we're taking action to be prepared to meet head on. So hopefully that's answered your question.
Thank you. Do you have a supplementary question?
Thanks, David. That's useful. From speaking to professional colleagues and residents on the doorsteps of Fairwater and across Torfaen, I know people are worried about universal credit. What are Torfaen County Borough Council doing to mitigate the negative impacts upon residents?
Split into two, actually. Sorry, Emil. Split into two, because we've actually done, over the past term and before that, actually, we've been quite proactive in prioritising welfare reform. We've made a lot of changes and interventions that have benefited welfare reform mitigation as a whole, but also specifically universal credit. So quite fortunately, I got a list that I had lingering around from a scrutiny committee that I had attended, and this features a list of some of the mitigations we put in place. Of which, in March 2016, we put an advice service, an outreach advice service. We funded that through Citizens Advice in all food banks. So people who turn up to food banks, they turn up for food, they turn up for heating, and they've got all sorts of that's the reason why they're there. They're financial issues. So it makes perfect sense to have Citizens Advice advisors in there, helping them become more resilient and figure out their finances. So we funded that. Similarly, we've funded the accommodation costs of Eastern Valley Food Bank. We've provided Citizens Advice with an additional capacity to help clients required to undergo a medical reassessment process, such as the change from DLA to PIP, which is PIP. I won't get started on that. It's an appalling benefit change that has devastated some people's lives, and I will go on in greater length when we have a seminar on that. Like I said, we've invested in the Welsh Church Fund, which has absolutely been vital. It's previously been a fund that's been used to fund all sorts of things, but the Constitution allows us to use it for whatever, and we've chosen to prioritise it for hardship. So this is people coming for food, who can't pay for heating, electricity, Their boiler's broken down, their washing machine's broken down, their fridge is broken down. Just covering all the basic costs you can think from day to day that we take for granted. It covers that. They come to that, and then they get all sorts of wraparound services which sort of step in there and help them out. We've got the financial inclusion team. Obviously, we've had the change in Communities First over the past year, and that has had a significant impact. Can't say I've been supportive of Welsh Government's change, but we have to deal with it. We've chosen to prioritise financial inclusion locally because that has the biggest impact. This helps connect people with the benefit services that they deserve, they're entitled to, and helps them manage their finances, put them on a more resilient path. So we've prioritised that. Quite proud that we've prioritised that. We funded a social prescriber in the north, partially funded a social prescriber in the north and south of the borough, which basically they've situated in GP surgeries. People come in and they'll come in and they've got all sorts of problems, and rather than go to see the doctors, it's more often than not mental health issues, so they'll go to see the social prescriber, and that social prescriber will then connect them with people which will help them in all those other sort of aspects, those aspects which the doctor just doesn't have time to do. It's quite a long list, I'm really sorry. We've prioritised third sector grant funding, sorry I'm stumbling over my words, because quite frankly third sector charities out there in the borough, they provide what we can't for a cost that is a fraction of what it would incur to us. So it's vital that we support and fund third sector organisations, so we'll continue to do that, and we've prioritised that. I chair the Welfare Reform Project Group, which has been a partnership of all our local RSLs, Citizens Advice, everybody's got a stake in welfare reform. We all meet together on a periodic basis where we talk about what's on the horizon, universal credit most recently, and basically we talk about what we can actually do about it. It's one of the best things that I've been involved in, because we actually talk about what we can do. You might have seen in the news that our council, the discretionary housing payment service that we provide, we're the best in Wales, and all credit to the team, the Revenue and Benefits team. They absolutely get what it's like on the ground there, and they've absolutely supported people in crisis. I won't go too long into this actually, because I think I've gone over time anyway. What I'll do is I'll put a letter to it. I'll put out an email to everybody listing all the mitigations that we've put in place already to help people through welfare reform, and I'm just trying to desperately get into my laptop because I have the stuff that we're currently looking at doing in the future. Bear with me. Right. So those are the things we've done. What we're going to do going forward is we're working to log and record the issues of the universal credit in real time so that it can be fed to the right part of the system to resolve, as well as provide an evidence base for our parliamentary representation. We're looking at how we can secure the financial inclusion team previously funded by Communities First, as mentioned. I have given a personal assurance that this is our highest priority. We're working with partners to look at specific proposals that help mitigate universal impacts. For example, last week the Welfare Reform Project Group has held a special meeting to review a number of ideas. I'll be sharing the outcome with Cabinet colleagues in terms of recommending a relatively small amount of our Early Intervention Prevention Fund, which we've set aside, which is £500,000, which I'm internally grateful for, because this is going to go some way towards mitigating some of the worst impacts of universal credit. Funds from the council's revenue budget and are directed in this way. And finally, our Revenue and Benefits Department have been working with DWP by providing dedicated support to assist customers to claim and manage their financial affairs. I will therefore be discussing with the leader the timing of our next Welfare Reform Project Group members seminar, and we can share all of this information in more detail than I've given you today. Thank you for both questions.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Daniels. Moving on to agenda item 15. Say this, can't press it. Okay, and the date of next meeting. For your information, members, the next council meeting is scheduled for Tuesday the 17th of October at 10 a.m. in the council chamber. Agenda item 16. Cabinet decisions from the 5th of September. Members, the Cabinet decisions start on page 129 of the agenda. There were no challenges to any of the decisions. Do members have any questions about the decisions? No? Are we all okay to note the Cabinet decisions? Yeah. Thank you, members. Those decisions are noted. That is the end of the council meeting. Thank you for your attendance and contributions. Can I just remind people to sign the attendance register, put your interests in and leave your cards on the wall. Thank you.